Hello and welcome to the Miraculous Lightworkers channel, your go-to place for all things about Lightworkers and enlightenment. I'm your host, Wendy. Today we're going to be covering Chapter 3 from A Course in Miracles. For those of you following along in your own book, this is on page 36, and the chapter itself is entitled The Innocent Perception. The section 1, which we will be covering, is called Atonement Without Sacrifice. I ask you, before we go into this, to really enter this with an open mind. If you come from a Christian background, some of the things that you hear will be rather shocking in nature, probably, but it's foundational, and I think that the deeper that you get into the text, the more you'll understand why these things are so. Number 1. A further point must be perfectly clear before any residual fear still associated with miracles can disappear. The crucifixion did not establish the atonement. The resurrection did. Many sincere Christians have misunderstood this. No one who is free of belief in scarcity could possibly make this mistake. If the crucifixion is seen from an upside-down point of view, it does appear as if God permitted and even encouraged one of his sons to suffer because he was good. This particularly unfortunate interpretation, which arose out of projection, has led many people to be bitterly afraid of God. Such anti-religious concepts enter into many religions. Yet the real Christian should pause and ask, how could this be? Is it likely that God himself would be capable of the kind of thinking which his own words have clearly stated is unworthy of his Son? Number 2. The best defense, as always, is not to attack another's position, but rather to protect the truth. It is unwise to accept any concept if you have to invert a whole frame of reference in order to justify it. This procedure is painful in its minor applications and genuinely tragic on a wider scale. Persecution frequently results in an attempt to justify the terrible misperception that God himself persecuted his own Son on behalf of salvation. The very words are meaningless. It has been particularly difficult to overcome this because although the error itself is no harder to correct than any other, many have been unwilling to give it up in view of its prominent value as a defense. In milder forms, a parent says, "This hurts me more than it hurts you," and feels exonerated in beating a child. Can you believe our Father really thinks this way? It is so essential that all such thinking be dispelled that we must be sure that nothing of this kind remains in your mind. This is coming from the position of Christ speaking. I was not punished because you were bad. The holy benign lesson the atonement teaches is lost if it is tainted with this kind of distortion in any form. The statement, vengeance is, we're entering number 3. The statement, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, is a misperception by which one assigns his own evil past to God. The evil past has nothing to do with God. He did not create it, and he does not maintain it. God does not believe in retribution. His mind does not create that way. He does not hold your evil deeds against you. It is likely that he would hold them. Is it likely that he would hold them against me? Again, that's coming from Christ's perspective, asking the question, is it likely that God would hold your evil deeds against me? Think about that question coming from Christ. Be very sure that you recognize how utterly impossible this assumption is, and how entirely it arises from projection. This kind of error is responsible for a host of related errors, including the belief that God rejected Adam and forced him out of the Garden of Eden. It is also why you may believe from time to time that I am misdirecting you. I have made every effort to use words that are almost impossible to distort, but it is always possible to twist symbols around if you wish. Number 4. Sacrifice is a notion totally unknown to God. I'm going to pause just really briefly because it instantly recalls to mind the part of the Old Testament where God basically is telling the Jewish people, don't come celebrate before me. Don't burn your offerings for me anymore. I detest it, is the way that it was written. Okay? Because he wants people, his children, to be a living sacrifice to him, not to believe that we can make these occasional offerings as, our supposed atonement for sin, and then think that somehow we can just turn around right after the fact and just go right on our merry way doing the same thing we were doing before, and we'll just come back and we'll just give another offering and that will be acceptable. He was saying, you're missing the point. And I don't want you to think that sacrificing something for me is what I'm asking you to do. It's not that he didn't appreciate the gesture, I suppose you could say, but he said, look, you're missing the point. I see what you're trying to do, but that's not what I want. Okay, so I'll continue now. Sacrifice is a notion totally unknown to God. It arises solely from fear, and frightened people can be vicious. Sacrificing in any way is a violation of my injunction that you should be merciful, even as your Father in heaven is merciful. It has been hard for many Christians to realize that this applies to themselves. Good teachers never terrorize their students. To terrorize is to attack, and this results in rejection of what the teacher offers. The result is learning failure. Number 5. I have been correctly referred to as the Lamb of God who taketh away the sins of the world. But those who represent the Lamb as blood-stained do not understand the meaning of the symbol. Correctly understood, it is a very simple symbol that speaks of my innocence. The lion and the lamb lying down together symbolize that strength and innocence are not in conflict, but naturally live in peace. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God, is another way of saying the same thing. A pure mind knows the truth, and this is its strength. It does not confuse destruction with innocence because it associates innocence with strength, not with weakness. That's an incredibly important concept moving forward. I would say critical to really understand that last sentence before you get deeper into the course, because everything builds upon that sentence. I'm going to say it one more time. It does not confuse destruction with innocence because it associates innocence with strength, not weakness. Number 6. Innocence is incapable of sacrificing anything because the innocent mind has everything and strives only to protect its wholeness. It cannot project. It can only honor other minds because honor is the natural greeting of the truly loved to others who are like them. The Lamb taketh away the sins of the world in the sense that the state of innocence or grace is one in which the meaning of the atonement is perfectly apparent. The atonement is entirely unambiguous. It is perfectly clear because it exists in light. Only the attempts to shroud it in darkness have made it inaccessible to those who do not choose to see. Number 7. The atonement itself radiates nothing but truth. It therefore epitomizes harmlessness and sheds only blessing. It could not do this if it arose from anything but perfect innocence. Innocence is wisdom because it is unaware of evil, and evil does not exist. I'll return to that in a minute. It is, however, perfectly aware of everything that is true. The resurrection demonstrated that nothing can destroy truth. Good can withstand any form of evil as light abolishes forms of darkness. The atonement is therefore the perfect lesson. It is the final demonstration that all the other lessons I taught are true. If you can accept this one generalization now, there will be no need to learn from many smaller lessons. You are released from all errors if you believe this. Number 8. The innocence of God is the true state of the mind of his Son. In this state, your mind knows God. For God is not symbolic, he is fact. Knowing his Son as he is, you realize that the atonement, not sacrifice, is the only appropriate gift for God's altar, where nothing except perfection belongs. The understanding of the innocent is truth. That is why their altars are truly radiant. Okay, so that concludes the first section of chapter 3. Again, that one is entitled Atonement Without Sacrifice. I said I would return to this particular sentence first before I sort of expound any more on the rest of it. It says, innocence is wisdom because it is unaware of evil, and evil does not exist. First of all, this takes me straight to the scripture where Jesus is talking about, unless you become as little children, you can't even enter the kingdom of heaven. Because the entering the kingdom of heaven is completely dependent upon your ability to see through the eyes of truth and innocence in the way that you were created before any of the falsity that the ego introduced into your perception made you believe that you were anything other than what God created. That's what the ego spends all of its time occupied on trying to convince you, is that you were not created perfectly, that there's something about you that's unlovable. That's what the ego wants you to believe, that you are not worthy of the love of God, of another human being, of yourself. The ego is a really interesting mechanism. I'm trying to find just the right words here because it's untrue. And so this is what they're talking about when they say evil does not exist. Anything that we perceive and conceive of as evil is a projection made by the ego. When we return to a state of truth, of what we really, truly are, all of that will fall away and be dissolved into the nothingness from whenceforth it came. We see a lot in our surroundings, our environment, that would very much like to testify to evil existing. The reason why the Course says that it doesn't exist is because God chooses to forgive you and overlook that. And that can be really infuriating to the ego because the ego wants to attack everybody, blame everybody, find fault with everybody. it's what the ego does. It's the antithesis of God. It's the antithesis of innocence. It doesn't like that God created you perfectly innocent, and so it always tries to attack your innocence, because that is all the ego has, is attack. It knows that it will be laid aside. This is how deep and well hidden this thing is, right in plain sight. And so it will try to convince you in every way conceivable that evil most definitely exists. And it's very hard to look at the world and see the things that people do and say evil doesn't exist, because we see evidence of what the ego's done all over the place. God didn't create the ego. It's what happened in our belief that separation occurred. It was a very fearful thing when we came to believe that we were separated from our source. It never happened, but we believed it happened. And when we believed it happened, we tried to hide, and we tried to hide behind the facade of our ego. This is really deep, heady stuff, but it's the universal truth. It exists in truth for you. It exists in truth for me, and for every single person you have ever met or will ever meet. That's where it comes down to a very sort of cataclysmic awareness, in a way, where you can actually beam the spotlight down onto that ego, realize all of the non-reality that tries to convince you that it's real and that God is not, because it will always call God a liar. It will always say, God didn't create you perfect. Same parable that was painted in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve. What did they come across when they were confronted with the talking serpent in the garden? The snake comes to them and says, God didn't. You're not going to die. God told them you're going to die. Okay, this whole thing is this huge sort of tantamount parable that you have to really let it dawn in your mind what was actually going on there, and what was cloaked in metaphors for us to find out and come to awareness now, where the ascension is happening. People are coming to the awareness, and our minds and our spirits are just sort of expanding so fast that it's really mind-boggling, because for the majority of human history, this wasn't happening. Maybe because the powers that be, Sadducees, Pharisees, all of the heads of church and state, were very happy to keep the masses ignorant and illiterate and tell them what to believe. And now we're coming to a point where there's no excuse anymore to not be literate and not dive into these things, these truths that are going to set us free as spiritual beings. If you want to see the pain and the suffering, or what we believe is pain and suffering and supposedly evil in the world, disappear, this is what has to happen. We don't have a choice but to let our awareness come to fruition. And so we're transcending, whether we like it or not, in a very fast way. The quickening is upon us, and we are no longer capable of holding on to the lies that we were taught and we don't want to admit they were lies, because then we think that we're judging somebody else for how they did life and what they taught us. They were just following the script of whatever they were given before. So there is no anger and no judgment in it, nothing like that. There's no attack in it. It's just awareness. It's just awareness. It's just a thank you, God, that we here and now are alive on this planet to witness and partake in this and to participate in this. It is your privilege to be living at this moment. This is the moment when all of our ancestors anticipated for, prayed for, believed for, kept the word alive for, we're there now. And that is a very powerful thing for us to be alive in this now moment with this gift just handed to us, which hundreds and maybe thousands of generations were praying for. Here we are. It's happening. There's no going back. And we have to rise to the occasion. Because we've come to the point where not rising to the occasion is so much more painful than just accepting that perhaps we weren't right and that our ancestors weren't right about some things, and that in order for us to anchor in heaven on earth, be the change that we wish to see, we have no choice but to come to the awareness of the truth. People don't like absolutes because they say, well, wait a second, if that's right, then these other things that I thought are wrong, and there's self-judgment tied up in that. But I'm here to convey, as a light worker, coming on behalf of the greatest light worker that ever lived in the history of humanity, my master, Yeshua, that the time is here for us to come to our fullness. He said it was available to us in his time. He said, the kingdom of heaven is at hand, but ye perceive it not. They couldn't understand what was going on. And so, by default, they remained in ignorance. And that is not an attack on what occurred. It's a factual statement that they ignored, not knowing what they didn't know. Ignorance means that they just ignored it. And it wasn't some, 4-letter curse on the name of a person to call them ignorant. It was just they didn't know what they didn't know. And even though it was trying to be conveyed to them, they couldn't receive it. Their minds just weren't open to it, and they were not willing to move that swiftly into the consciousness that Christ was giving to them. He was handing it to them on a silver platter. He said, look, it's here, it's now, I could give it to you, but even though I keep trying to give it to you, everywhere I go, people deny me. They see my miracles, and yet they come to persecute me. So that's where we find ourselves now. And the only way to go back to this is to come into the strength of our innocence. That's the amazing part. This particular section here really sums up the atonement quite clearly, because I think it's very difficult for people to understand what the atonement is and how to perceive and conceive of it. The atonement is therefore the perfect lesson. It is the final demonstration that all the other lessons I taught are true. If you can accept this one generalization now, there will be no need to learn from many smaller lessons. You are released from all errors if you believe this, that the atonement is true, that the concept that in your perfect innocence, returning to that which is the truth in you, the way that God created you, actually collapses time. This goes to the original principles at the beginning of chapter 1. There's the 50 principles of miracles, and it lays out the fact that we have the ability to collapse time. We could have done it when Christ was walking on this planet. But because we could not perceive of the truth of what he was telling us, we couldn't sort of weed through the parables that he was teaching to understand what he was saying. Our minds just weren't open to it and ready for it. Whoever was alive at that time wasn't open to it and ready for it. And so it was like the blind leading the blind because they wouldn't follow Christ. And he said, I'm not even accepted in my own hometown. I come here and I tell you the truth. I swear it to you. This is reality. And the only ones among him who were capable of walking in his footsteps were the apostles. And even they had trouble casting out demons and doing things like that, which is, essentially what they're saying here is that the evil does not exist. Those are all things conceived in the mind of the ego. So here we start walking into some really strange territory, kind of, because there's a lot of talk of angels and demons and all of the things that are associated with the history of biblical lore. A lot of those things, if you really were to dig through the Old Testament, there was some amazing supernatural things happening. I'm of the mind that if God shows it to me with my spiritual sight and makes it clear to me, then I will believe it. But there's a lot of superstition and subscriptions to stories that people have proliferated that don't help us. They don't move us towards the truth. They're based in fear. And they don't say, look, we have the power to overcome that. They say, look, we should be so scared. We should be so fearful. We're going to hell if we don't do this or that. And I think it's really important to just, it takes a lot of time in meditation with these concepts to realize Jesus never told anyone that they were going to hell. The hellfire concept came later. He wasn't trying to scare people like that. He was trying to wake them up to their potential. I'm going to go ahead and read the end here from number 8 one more time before I close this out. The innocence of God is the true state of mind of his Son. In this state, your mind knows God. For God is not symbolic. He is fact. Knowing his Son as he is, you realize that the atonement, not sacrifice, is the only appropriate gift for God's altar, where nothing except perfection belongs. The understanding of the innocent is truth. That is why their altars are truly radiant. I love this because it is so rare to really see people who have this truth in them of the innocence that God created, and that's sitting on the throne of their heart, that the truth of God is there, and it erases all the lies of darkness. It says, I know how God created me. They shine. They absolutely radiate and pour out this beautiful light. And that's what it means for me to walk as a light worker. May I be so capable, so blessed to be the channel and the vessel for that to come through, to shine away all of the lies of darkness, everything that the ego would have you believe about who you are and why you've come here. That is a truly miracle ready state of mind. To be able to glow, literally touch people around you in such a way that they can feel the energy of your aura pouring out. And it affects them so much. It touches them and reminds them of their innocence. That's what light workers are really doing. It's a correction for darkness, because we come in and dispel negative energy, essentially. Send it back to the nothingness from whenceforth it came, because it doesn't belong here in the altar of my heart or your heart. We have to get this right. We have to learn to be the change that we wish to see. If you want to see the darkness in the world go away, be the willing recipient of that light. Bring it in and send it out. That's the highest good that you can perform for any of God's children on this planet, is to be willing to say, I'm not going to validate the darkness, the lie anymore, because I remember the truth in the cells of my body that are vibrating with the love of my Creator. He's in my memory. He's in your memory. And for us to be what He wishes us to be, what He sent us to be, the best and most important use of our time is to remember that no matter what lies somebody told you about who you are, what you're capable of, what you're here for, what you're worthy of, God sees you only the way that He made you, which is before all those stories. In perfection, in a state of grace, eternally, willing to completely absolve you of anything that you call sin, and remind you of the meaning of that word. It's a Greek word. It means to miss the mark. That's not how most people interpret that word. It has so much loaded energy all over that word. But that's all it is. It's all about course correction. He wants us back. In order for us to come back, we have to dissolve the lies with the light. We bring it in, and instantly, that's where the miracles occur. Just by virtue of flipping on the light, the darkness just goes away. And where did it go? It wasn't real, so it just dissolved. That's where we get into the metaphysical principles of a miracle. And it works the same way with the illusion of time. Time collapses just like darkness flees from light. We have the power to do that. That's why I teach A Course in Miracles, is because when I learned these principles for myself, my mind was absolutely opened up like it had never been before to understand what Christ really wants to do in us and through us in the world, that it cannot come any other way. So we have to respond to this at some point, or we continue to perpetuate all of the pain in the world. I had to make a conscious decision at some point, pretty early on in my learning with the Course, that I didn't want to be that anymore. I don't want to do that. I'm willing to do the work. And it felt like suffering, a lot of it, because I had to let go of a lot of things that I thought I wanted to hold on to mentally that validated me in order to heal, so I could be not somebody who was wounded, walking in the world, wounding other people, because you will, if you conceive of yourself as being somebody who is wounded. I think the saying goes, if you walk around believing that you're wounded, you're going to bleed on people who never cut you. And that's really irresponsible. And that's what most people are doing. And I'm not judging anybody who's doing that, because that's the universal truth. We've all done it. Nobody is free of that. Everybody at some point has a reason why they believed in the justification of their victimhood. We're talking metaphysical concepts. The wounding that came from our parents, our spouses, our siblings, our religious, people who delivered some things that they thought were truths, but that really sidetracked us a lot because they had us confused about who and what we were and what we came for. With that thought, I'm just going to go ahead and say thank you so much for being willing to come here, being willing to come to a place of truth, even though doing so may mean dropping some long-held beliefs that you've held dear, but that have been really harmful to you ultimately and others in your life. I thank you on account of the Most High for being willing to step back into the truth of who you really are, the way that your loving Father in heaven created you, and being willing to be part of the healing and the ascension. Like I said, it's happening. It's happening. Thank God it's happening, right? How many generations have prayed and waited for this and thought that they were going to see it and anticipated it, lived their entire lives waiting for the coming days when the ascension would occur. And I could almost be just absolutely in tears because of how joyous this is. Really tears of joy. And we are the generations that get to witness this and participate in it and anchor in the new reality. I know that sounds to some people like a fairly threatening thought in a way, oddly, but that's coming from a place of ego. And the spirit in you of truth wants it. I assure you of that. I thank you so much for being willing to be a channel of light and beauty in this world and anchor in the truth. If you found this video interesting, please share this out. because this is happening and people are confused. There's a lot of confusion at this moment because the shift in energy is happening so rapidly that it's a little disconcerting for some because they aren't sure what's happening. And so I hope that this found you and touched your heart so much that you will be willing to share this with others, because we're going there. It's happening. And we all have to come to this place of truth together, you know? That's how we do it. Everybody needs to be all in pretty much. It's God does not will for any of his children to be left behind. And so we're in this perpetual waiting game up until this moment, and it's happening now. And I'm really grateful that you're here for this and that I'm here for this. Thank you for your interest and your time. I really do appreciate it. Thank you so much. Join us next time as we all come together for more info and interaction, as we all uplift, enlighten, and ascend. Bye now.